Now, sometimes these beneficial mutations come from an unexpected source. And for example, on Wednesday, I don't know if anybody else heard the talk by Sean Carroll that was on the web on Wednesday. Anybody hear that? Yeah, okay. Remember, so you know what this is, the ice fish. Okay, and Sean Carroll was talking about basically information that's in his book, The Making of the Fittest. I think it's a horrible title, but we'll put up with that. Okay, but it is a wonderful book, and if you're not familiar with any of Sean Carroll's works, or even if you are, if you haven't seen Making of the Fittest, I think it's probably the best recent evolution book going, because it really explains a lot of the issues in a very, very clear way, without a whole bunch of mathematical jargon. But at any rate, one of the examples that he talks about is this critter here, which is called an ice fish. And these are fish that live in the very super cool waters around the Antarctic. And these fish have a number of interesting adaptations, one of which is that they've lost their ability, they don't have any red blood cells, okay? But the other thing they have is a protein that's an antifreeze protein. And this particular antifreeze protein is an entirely new adaptation that arose, strangely enough, from a digestive enzyme, I believe it's called tryptanosin. And this enzyme wasn't apparently being used at the time, and it mutated in just a certain way that just by chance happened to make it useful as an antifreeze, a beneficial mutation arising entirely by chance. Okay? All right. So we can get novel adaptations, if you will, to use the creationist jargon, new information via mutation in natural selection. Okay. Next slide. One of the other problems that people have with evolution, and quite frankly in science in general, I couldn't resist. I found this on Flickr, and I couldn't resist it. Is what's called teleology. And teleology is, in case you don't know this word, means one of the meanings is something that is goal-directed toward a final goal. Okay, so in religion, teleology would be the study of the end times and that sort of thing. And in biology, it would be that evolution is goal-directed. Okay, and so some of that misconception, I think, comes about from diagrams like this, where you see the primitive brownback fish going backwards, actually. But, right? So sometimes I think these sorts of things contribute to the idea that evolution is goal-directed. You know, Gregory, in his writing, sees that this is very common in children, but it's also common in adults as well, at least in my college-aged adults. So for example, if you ask a beginning biology student why plants produce oxygen, a significant number of them will say, so we can breathe. And you laugh, but this sort of reasoning is embedded in the thought processes of most people. It's actually sort of a natural thought process, even though that may sound kind of heretical to say that. Okay, and that's not all. One of my colleagues had a student respond to a question about why the outer wall of the heart on the left side is thicker than the corresponding wall on the right side. And the student's answer, so we can tell left from right. You know, my response to the instructor was, well, I think the intelligent designer would have been better just stamping left and right. Anyway, but you know, teleology sometimes gets very subtle. For example, sometimes I hear, and I actually heard a biologist who would know better, should know better, say something like this, that well, you know, species have reproductive isolating mechanisms in order to survive, or something like that. Or students will say things like, the polar bear has a white fur because that's beneficial to the species. Okay, in other words, they're misunderstanding the nature of natural selection and the level at which evolution usually operates. Okay. Gregory gives a good example of this, where a student would say, fungi grow in forests to help decomposition. You know, of course, fungi grow in forests because there's lots of great food for them to eat, but that seems to be lost on many people. A student asked me the other day, how does evolution know what mutations are needed? And that was kind of discouraging because I had already talked about mutations being random and evolution not being able to look ahead. But needless to say. Now, another hang-up, next slide, that people have, or another problem that people have is anthropomorphic language. You know, where you endow something that doesn't deserve it with human attributes, okay? And along with that, intentionality, okay? And even evolutionists are prone to this. In fact, sometimes they're the worst creators of this kind of problem. So, for example, Richard Dawkins talks about what kind of gene? Selfish genes, okay? People who study kin selection, which is related to the evolution of social insects, will talk about altruistic genes. There's a fellow by the name of Robert Trivers, whom some of you know of, who offspring conflict, or more recently, he has a book with another co-author, Genes in Conflict. Gregory gives other examples of adaptations being viewed, even by scientists, as inventions or solutions to a problem. I mean, sometimes we even talk about reproductive strategies as if plants and animals are calculating how many resources should be invested in males versus females. I suppose that some other cognitively sophisticated animals, such as this one here, are able to do these sorts of calculations. In fact, there's a recent paper suggesting that if you, in a chimp society, if you have a lower ranked chimp and you teach that chimp a new and valuable skill, he gets groomed more often than he used to. Apparently grooming is chimpanzee money. And even the term natural selection itself, as Gregory points out, has potential for confusion because people might think that selection in this case is an active process where something is intending to select some things versus others. So we have to really be careful with the sort of language that we use sometimes. And I have something here, and I can't remember what it is. Okay, granted, Trivers and Dawkins don't mean to be anthropomorphic, you know, but they're using this for kind of shorthand language to avoid lengthy explanations, and that's okay as long as you're really clear about what's going on. And sometimes this kind of language sneaks into the popular sphere. For example, a good example is Michael Pallin's book, Botany of Desire. Who's read that? You know, what does he talk about in there? He talks about plants taking advantage of people to further their evolution or something like that. And I just cringed, it seems, every other page when I was reading that book, which otherwise is a great book and I recommend it highly, but the language leaves some work here. You know, and I'm not for complete purging of this language, but because it is a useful tool used appropriately. But, you know, we've got to be careful to reinforce that that's what we're doing. So when we're talking about genes, altruistic genes, we don't mean that there's necessarily a gene for altruism, but the effect on the animal might be to have it behave in a certain way that we interpret anthropomorphically sometimes as altruism. Okay, see what I'm saying? Okay, next slide. Typological thinking. Typological thinking, or essentialist thinking as it's sometimes called. In evolution, this plays out in the idea that species consist or involve a single type or essence. And it goes back to the old Platonic idea that there was some kind of ideal form and some sort of metaphysical space. Where it is never specified. And that what we call real objects are sort of accidental shadows cast by the ideal form. So, and this is an idea that was long been ingrained in human thought and theology. And this type of notion relates to what I sometimes call the idea that an object has an intrinsic nature. Okay, like a chair. Does a chair really have an intrinsic nature, a chairness? I don't think so, but this was a common idea and still is common sometimes. And where it crops up as a problem is, many times, is with the notion of a species. Species is a unit of classification, which may or may not have much validity in the real world.